Welcome, everyone, and let's jump right into today's explainer. We are going to be exploring a truly fascinating academic essay by Marc Bates. It's a piece that brilliantly bridges neuroscience, philosophy, and theology to answer what is arguably the most fundamental question we can possibly ask. What does it actually mean to be human? We've got a lot of ground to cover in this explainer, but we have a really clear roadmap. We are going to move step by step from secular philosophy through biblical theology and finally land on some incredibly impactful real-world bioethics. Okay, let's dive into this by looking at what the author calls the mind-body crisis. Right now, we're facing an anthropological crisis caught between two extreme, conflicting views of human nature. On one side, you've got secular biological physicalism. This is essentially the idea that you are just your brain, period. Humans are just neurochemical mechanisms, meaning things like consciousness and moral agency, they're just accidental byproducts of brain states. But then, on the totally opposite end, you have Hellenistic dualism. This is that ancient, almost Platonic idea that your physical body is just a disposable shell or even a prison for your soul. Bates argues that both of these extremes completely fail to capture our actual lived experience, and as we'll see, they fail the test of biblical coherence too. So, Bates proposes a middle way, a synthesis known as holistic substance dualism. Basically, this is the claim that the human person is an integrated compound of an immaterial soul and a material body, and I really want to emphasize that word, integrated. This view argues that while the soul is distinct, our physical bodies absolutely matter. They are an essential, sacred part of who we are, not just temporary shells we're trying to escape. So let's look at the philosophical defense for this. I want you to think about this question for a second. Through normal metabolic turnover, your body's physical cells are constantly dying and being replaced. You are literally turning over material all the time. So if you are strictly just your physical matter, are you still the exact same person you were 10 or 20 years ago? It's a pretty profound rhetorical challenge to how we maintain our true identity over time if we're just made of atoms. And bringing in the work of philosopher Paul Copan, the author points out that strict physicalism faces three major philosophical hurdles. First is that identity across time we just mentioned. Think about it. Holding someone morally accountable for a crime they committed a decade ago logically requires a persistent immaterial subject that outlasts all that cellular turnover. Second is the unity of consciousness. How are all of our scattered, totally separate sensory inputs somehow experienced by a single, unified I? And third is libertarian agency. That's your power to make true, genuine choices, which is practically impossible to explain if we are just a determined chain reaction of physical atoms. To push this even further, Bates brings in a foundational rule of logic called Leibniz's Law of Indiscernibility of Identicals. Now, that is a mouthful, I know, but it actually just means that if two things are truly identical, every single property true of one must be true of the other. Well, think about mental states, things like hope or grief or joy. They completely lack physical properties. You can't weigh hope. Grief doesn't have spatial volume. So logically, because of that difference, they literally cannot be identical to physical brain states. Now you might be wondering, what about the clinical objections? Let's talk about science and the soul. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the core arguments. Correlation is not reduction. What does that mean? Well, Bates uses this awesome analogy of a musician and an instrument. If you take a violin and you damage it, the music it produces is going to be distorted, right? But that distortion doesn't prove that the musician is the violin. It just shows that the musician depends on the instrument while they are performing. It's the exact same thing with the brain. Physical trauma can alter the mind's expression, sure, but that doesn't prove the mind is merely physical tissue. The author takes a very modest approach when interpreting clinical evidence here. He points out that data from cortex stimulation and split brain cases actually end up being pretty ambiguous, but where it gets really interesting is when he highlights covert awareness fMRI studies, like the famous 2006 Owen study. They took patients who appeared completely 100% unresponsive, put them into brain scanners, and asked them to imagine doing things. And incredibly, their brains lit up in all the right places. This shows that residual conscious cognition can exist entirely beneath absent motor output. That puts massive pressure on materialistic assumptions that say if there's no physical response, the person must be extinguished. So how does all of this align with theology? Let's check out the biblical blueprint. If we look all the way back at Genesis 2:7, the original biblical authors clearly saw the human person as having two distinct sources. There is a physical, terrestrial origin, the dust of the earth, and a transcendent, immaterial origin, the divine breath.
These two things function as one complete living whole during earthly life, but it clearly points to a dualistic implication right from the start.
Let's move to and see how this builds across history. Following scholar Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s promised plan of God, we can trace this progressive divine purpose from creation, through Abraham, Sinai, David, all the way to the New Covenant and ultimately the future resurrection. And the consistent thread, God's promises always involve a concrete, embodied future. It is never about some ethereal, spiritualized escape from the physical world. Which brings us to a really critical theological distinction regarding death and resurrection. To unpack this, the author points to historical Chalcedonian logic regarding Jesus himself, what's known as concretist Christology. Because Jesus had a fully human soul, the time between his crucifixion and resurrection serves as the absolute prime example of an intermediate disembodied state. During those 3 days, the divine person remained united to the physical body lying in the tomb, while simultaneously remaining united to the human soul in paradise.
So we have to clarify the difference here. The intermediate disembodied state is essentially a waiting period. It's described as a temporary, unnatural bereavement of the self. The ultimate bodily resurrection, on the other hand, is the final promise of imperishable physical bodies in a renewed earth. The ultimate biblical hope isn't to just float around as a permanently disembodied soul in heaven. It's a transformed, solid, physical resurrection.
Okay, bringing this all home, why does the soul actually matter to us right now? Bates contrasts two completely different models of human worth. A lot of utilitarian bioethics relies on a capacity-based worth model. This means a person's value is directly tied to what they can do, their exercisable reason, or their will. The huge danger here is that it immediately marginalizes the most vulnerable among us, like infants or individuals with profound intellectual disabilities. In stark contrast, the biblical ontological status-based worth model views the imago Dei, the image of God, as an indestructible divine decree. Your worth isn't based on your physical brain capacity. It is an endowed, permanent status. So the crucial point is, this idea of holistic dualism isn't just high-level philosophy. It has massive practical, pastoral, and bioethical consequences for us today. It means that dementia care doesn't wait around on cognitive scores because that person remains a full image bearer regardless of physical decline. It means our material bodily needs are sacred, not just distractions from the spiritual life. And it offers deep, profound comfort in bereavement, giving us confidence that the soul absolutely persists in the intermediate state while waiting for that ultimate bodily resurrection. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. If human dignity truly rests on an endowed spiritual status, rather than just our physical brain capacity, how must that change the way we treat the most vulnerable among us? It's a profound implication of being an ensouled image bearer, and it certainly leaves us with a lot to reflect on. Thank you so much for joining me today.